That's me. That's pretty much it for me. So I am now introducing our new farm program director, which I'm very excited about this hire here. He is originally from St. Louis, Missouri, which we won't hold that against him, but he's lived in Seattle for 13 years. He most recently was a postdoctoral research associate with WSU's Center for Sustainable Ag and Natural Resources. His research focused on the beneficial use of recycled organic materials as soil amendments. He also evaluated various strategies for cover cropping and composting. He's frequently created educational programming for farmers, gardeners, and the ag industry professionals. He's been the farm program director for Tilth Alliance for just over 2 months now. And while he hopes to help local, regional, statewide producers find solutions to their problems. When not digging in the dirt, he enjoys running, reading, cooking, and hiking. So I'm very excited about Nate. Nate Stacey, I'm introducing here. I already said that. He's also done research on my farms, and it's been a pleasure working with him. So here we go. Nate, take it away. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone. So for the first time in 2 years, I know for certain that I am not on mute. So, though later you might wish that you could turn the mute button on after I talk for about 5 minutes. So I have a long list of housekeeping items that I'm going to go over first. So thank you for prioritizing the health and safety of all our attendees, as well as the Tilth Alliance and Convention Center staff. Remember to keep your masks on unless you are actively eating, drinking, or speaking like I'm doing now. And if you're feeling sick, please do go home. We want to give a big thanks to our conference sponsors. That includes Human Links Foundation, Cloudview Farm, Snohomish County Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Badger Mountain Winery, Cascadia Produce, King County, Washington Farmland Trust, and the WSDA Regional Markets. In addition, we want to acknowledge and thank all our conference sponsors and trade show partners. So thank you for your support. We wouldn't be here without you. We want to give a big thank you to the 2021 Tilth Conference Advisory Committee who helped shape the format and direction of the conference this year. If you're interested in joining the 2022 Conference Advisory Committee, please write your name down on the sign-up sheet, which is at the registration table. Remember, we have a raffle going on today only. There will be 2 winners for 2 different prize baskets displayed at the registration table. The first is a Patagonia backpack and duffel bag. The second is a Tilth Alliance t-shirt, a Mirror water bottle, and a Patagonia hat. Hopefully I win it. Just kidding. Not, sort of. Each raffle ticket is $10, which you can buy at the registration table, or if you see a board member. We, tonight, are looking forward to our inaugural Seed Salon and Swap happening today from 5 to 6:30 in the lower concourse with High Mowing Seeds, Johnny's Selected Seeds, Organic Seed Alliance, Osborne Quality Seeds, King County Seed Lending Library, Hockey Farmers Collective, and the Garden Hotline. We're excited to announce that the 2022 application for the Washington State Organic and Sustainable Farming Fund will be opening on our website on November 23rd. That's this upcoming Tuesday. This grant program is a single-year grant running April through December with funding up to $10,000 available to farms seeking financial assistance to support projects for their farm and community. Applications for that program will be due January 23rd, 2022. Go to tilthalliance.org for more information. We're also excited to be able to announce the tentative location of next year's conference, which will be held in the Tri-Cities. We're excited to hear your thoughts about this, so please come find myself or Melissa or any of the Tilth staff and let us know what you think about that. Interpretation is available in one session in each time slot, so that's Remember that? There are all gender bathrooms now on the first floor. And lastly, we want to acknowledge that some of our farming community up in Skagit and Whatcom have been hit hard by the rains this past week and are dealing with some severe flooding. There are some GoFundMe that have been set up by community members to help support these farms. You should see slips at each table with a QR code and at the registration table. That's my entire list. So many of you I do know, and I don't want to spend too much time up here because you didn't come to hear me talk. There's much more important and more interesting people to speak. And some of you I don't know. So those of you that I do in both categories, really, come say hello if I haven't seen you in a while, or if I don't know you, come and introduce yourself. And I'd like to find some ways where we can partner together to solve some problems and then maybe create some new programs. With that said, I am now going to introduce Reese Torvald Hansen, who is coming to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to join all of you in person again here on Snohomish and Tulalip lands. It's my real sincere honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I think, like many of you, I am meeting Thea, who's a colleague and who's joined us at Agrarian Trust for the first time in person. So it's really fun and been wonderful to connect. So, yeah. Thea Maria Carlson is an earth steward, a farmer, a facilitator, community weaver, speaker, writer, and co-creator who collaborates with organizations, individuals, and communities at the intersections of food, agriculture, environmental stewardship, social justice, and regenerative economy. So Thea's going to come up and join us, and while she is giving her while they're giving their keynote, if you have questions, go ahead and write them on your pieces of paper at the center, and I will be circling the room to gather them. So just go ahead and grab me. Please join me in welcoming Thea.
Thank you, Reese. Just waiting for the slides to get up. So I want to begin by acknowledging all of the beings, seen and unseen, who are supporting us and gathering here today. And I invite you to take a moment with me to center yourself. Notice your breath moving in and out of your body, or maybe the food in your mouth. Feel your body supported by your seat and by the earth beneath it. Feel the gift that it is to be alive and be right here in this moment. I offer my gratitude to the Tulalip tribes, successors of the Snohomish, Snoqualmie, and Skykomish, and other allied tribes and bands upon whose homelands we are gathered. I offer gratitude for their stewardship of this land from time immemorial. I offer respect for their sovereignty and their right to self-determination. I honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. I offer gratitude to the Wapo people who from time immemorial have stewarded the land where I live and work in Northern California. I acknowledge and celebrate Wapo resilience, their ongoing sacred relationships with the land, waters, animals, plants, and other non-human residents of the Mayacamas Mountains. I offer gratitude to the entire planet Earth, who generously and unconditionally supports us in every moment of our lives. I offer gratitude to the soil, the water, the wind, the sun, the rain, and the fire that nurture all of us and the multitudes of other living beings with whom we share this planet. I offer gratitude to my ancestors, my mother Lorna, who gave birth to me at home in a bathtub about 10 miles from here in North Seattle on the lands of the Duwamish people, and raised me and my sister Zoe with a deep connection to nature in what she called Earth School. My father Mark, who tended the vegetable garden with baby me strapped to his back, and when I got old enough to help him, took me out to the garden to pick snails off the lettuce by flashlight and feed them to the ducks and geese at the nearby pond. My grandmother Ellen, who lived across the Cascades on the land of the Wenatchee people and taught me to sew and bake and make preserves. My grandfather Ted and grandmother Lydia, who lived on the land of the Wapo people, who shared their enjoyment of eating good organic food and took me on all-day adventures across the 250 acres they stewarded, learning the smells and textures of the Mayacamas Mountains that I now call home. My great-grandparents, Maria Duceu and Jesuinho, who traveled as teenagers from their homeland of Portugal to settle on the land of the Narragansett, Pokanoket, Wampanoag peoples, and passed down their love of olive oil and kale and homegrown tomatoes. I offer my gratitude to all of our ancestors, whose lives over countless generations made it possible for us to be here and give our gifts to the world. I offer gratitude to the farmers and farm workers who grew the food we just ate, to the animals and plants that gave their lives to nourish us. I offer gratitude to the people who harvested, washed, packed, processed, and transported the food to this convention center, the staff here who cooked and served the food and are now cleaning up after our meal. I offer gratitude to the people who prepared this space for us and the people who will come and clean up after we leave. I offer gratitude to the interpreters who are making these words accessible in Spanish in real time. I offer gratitude to the people who are stepping in to care for our children and elders and animals and plants so that we can be here at this conference, whether in person or online. I offer gratitude to my wife, E., who is home taking care of our animals in the land, who washed the dishes every night for the past week where I prepared this presentation, who is behind the camera in almost every photo of me you'll see, and who supports me in all my work in innumerable ways. I offer gratitude to all those who came before me, and for the technology that doesn't always work how I want it to. All those who came before me, the many, many people and non-human relatives whose knowledge and wisdom, research, and life experience have contributed to what I will share with you today. I am a farmer and an earth steward. I've been involved in farming and food systems for more than 20 years, beginning as a teenager when I volunteered as a farm labor organizer in the Central Valley of California. I've worked on urban and rural farms, developed school and community gardens, and helped thousands of other people grow food through educational work. For the past 6 years, I have lived and tended land in California at Monon's Rill, an intergenerational intentional community within the territory and homelands of the Wapo people. We co-steward 414 acres of land, incorporating an organic garden and orchard, bees, chickens, goats, and sustainable forestry. Just over a year ago, the land and community that is my home was devastated in the glass fire. In hot, dry winds, this wildfire blew 6 miles across the Napa Valley to our mountains and rapidly and severely burned our entire watershed. Just at Monon's Rill, the fire destroyed 12 homes, our barn, our chicken coop, our greenhouse, garden sheds, the orchard, and severely damaged our water infrastructure. With this fire, the climate crisis literally arrived on my doorstep. I came face to face with the reality that there is no running away from the deep crises we are in. and I found the courage to face and embrace the reality instead. Soon after the fire, I left my job of 10 years leading the National Biodynamic Association to shift my focus to hands-on work, regenerating the land and community, and learning to live with fire and the climate crisis in a new way. I installed straw wattles to protect our soil and water, and inoculated them with mushrooms to take up and transmute toxins from the burned houses and other buildings. I learned to use a chainsaw to cut dead and damaged trees and brush to make way for oak woodlands and other native plants to recover. I trained as a wildland firefighter, and I'm learning how to put good fire on the land. And in the past year, I've finally let in the deep grief of the climate crisis we are in. As this year's report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes clear, recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events like heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts more frequent and severe. Climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. The changes we experience will increase with further warming. Climate change is bringing more and more extreme weather events like the atmospheric rivers that are causing massive flooding right now in the Pacific Northwest. More frequent and severe droughts and heat waves that cause crop failures and stress natural ecosystems. Wildfires that are destroying entire communities and causing toxic smoke that impacts the health of people thousands of miles away. Human industrial activity has massively polluted our air, water, and land. Unsustainable agriculture and other land use are causing the loss of topsoil and biodiversity. A rampant speculative market is escalating land prices, driving them out of the reach of farmers. And the industrial food system is failing to adequately and appropriately feed humanity. Massive social disparities rooted in centuries of systemic oppression persist in health, food security, education, and many other measures of well-being. There is widespread and deep injustice with our institutions and the people within them disproportionately harming, killing, and locking up Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And on top of all these crises, we're having some communication issues. On top of all these crises is the global pandemic, which has caused over 5 million people to lose their lives, 250 million to become sick, and further exacerbated many of the other crises we are already facing. Farmers are on the front lines of all these crises, and I'm sure every single person in this room and viewing online has been directly affected in some way. It's easy to gloss over these, to push them away, but I invite you to really take it in. See if your heart can hold all that hurt. How can we grow food and steward land in ways that fully face and embrace these crises with courage and innovation? I have a lot of ideas. I want to warn you, there's a lot of information coming your way, but you don't need to write it all down. There's a website link right there, theamariacarlson.earth/tilth, and a QR code if you want to be fancy and scan it on your phone, so you can only write down what you want to write down and know you can get all this information later. Also, just as a reminder, if you have questions while I'm speaking, there is paper on your tables. You can write them down, and Reese will be collecting them. So I encourage you to write down any questions you'd like me to address after the presentation. All right, so facing and addressing the climate crisis. Why is the climate changing and leading to mounting instability and severe weather and temperature events? The main driver is carbon dioxide. And you might remember from a science class long ago that carbon is known as the building block of life. When a plant photosynthesizes, it captures energy from the sun and takes in carbon dioxide from the surrounding air and uses that carbon to create carbohydrates and releases oxygen back out. And those carbohydrates, those carbon compounds created through photosynthesis, form the roots, stems, and leaves of the plant and are also exuded through the roots to feed symbiotic microorganisms and fungi. 300 million years ago, there was 9 times as much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere as there is today. It was trees and other plants who took in that carbon dioxide and stored it in their bodies, which over time were buried and compressed under the surface of the earth. Countless generations of plants over millions of years reduced atmospheric carbon dioxide to levels that support human life and the millions of other living species with whom we share this planet. Over the past 250 years, humans have been rapidly and dramatically reversing this process by mining and burning the remains of those ancient living organisms now known as coal, oil, and natural gas to fuel industrialization, the plastics industry, global transportation, and other fun projects. As the scale of that activity has exploded, so have atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, leading to the dire climate crisis we now find ourselves in. So, as farmers, we can partner with those natural life processes to bring carbon out of the atmosphere and build healthy soil so the carbon comes from the air and into the living realm. Healthy soils are the largest store of terrestrial carbon, and there are many ways we can increase how much carbon is held in our soils. By restoring degraded soils and adopting soil conservation practices, there's major potential to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration, and build resilience to climate change. So far, there are 35 practices that have been identified by the Natural Resource Conservation Service that improve soil health and sequester carbon while producing benefits like increasing soil water holding capacity, biodiversity, and climate resilience. I'll be covering a few of these practices in my talk, but I encourage you to check out all of them and also see if you can get support for implementing those practices from the Natural Resource Conservation Service or your local resource conservation district. One of our most powerful partners in climate-friendly farming is compost. When we make compost, we are taking formerly living carbon-rich material and transforming it into a potent life source for our farms. And when we apply compost to our farms and rangelands, it provides powerful climate benefits. The Marin Carbon Project near me has been studying the ways that farms can increase carbon, and they've done a lot of studies on compost. They found that just one application of compost on pasture doubled forage production and soil carbon sequestration for 3 years after it was applied. And that happened in both wet and dry grasslands. They also found that the net ecosystem storage of carbon increased by 25 to 70% without including the carbon that was in the compost that they applied. Making and using our own compost is a core element of biodynamic farming, which is a holistic, ecological, and ethical approach, which I have been practicing and teaching for many years. A core principle of biodynamics is that a farm is a living organism, and the role of the farmer is to weave the elements of the farm together to create a self-sustaining whole. One unique aspect of biodynamics is the use of fermented spray and compost preparations to support the health of the soil and the plants. Biodynamic compost is enhanced and enlivened through the use of 6 herbal preparations made from yarrow, chamomile, stinging nettle, oak bark, dandelion, and valerian. Each of these medicinal herbs is transformed through a unique process that brings it into relationship with the animal kingdom, the earth, and the cycle of the year. The biodynamic preparations magnify the herb's healing qualities, foster the growth of beneficial bacteria and fungi, and create powerfully concentrated substances to guide the development of the compost. Biodynamic compost preparations strengthen the quality of the compost, stabilize nitrogen and other nutrients, multiply microbial diversity. And you can purchase the biodynamic preparations to put in your compost, or you can learn to make your own. When applied to a farm, biodynamic compost increases the soil life, increases stable organic matter, and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And this research comes from the DOC trials in Switzerland, which have studied conventional organic and biodynamic farming side by side for more than 40 years, in randomized controlled plots. Another recent comparative trial in California showed more carbon in organic vineyards than conventional, and even more carbon in biodynamic vineyards than organic. Another tool to build healthy soil and increase soil carbon is multi-species cover cropping. Keeping living plants in the soil for as much of the year as possible is key for your farm's carbon balance and for the health of your soil. Gabe Brown, who's a farmer in North Dakota, and other researchers have found that the more cover crop species you plant together, the better in terms of carbon and soil health. I'm really missing being online and you can just click the slide and see it. There are great things about being in person, but this remote and I are not getting along very well. Anyway, but look at those beautiful seeds. So if you want to get more benefit out of your multi-species cover crops, try a seed bath made with compost. So this is something that I learned from Dr. Christine Jones, a researcher in Australia. And she has found that bathing seeds in a cold compost extract, I use biodynamic compost, increases the number and diversity of beneficial microbes, the number, size, and health of plant roots, and therefore the amount of carbon that the plants are bringing into the soil. At least some of the magic of seed baths, as well as the biodynamic spray preparations, can be explained by quorum sensing, which is the process through which microbes communicate. When we put compost or a biodynamic preparation in water, all of the microbes within it release their chemical signature into the water, signaling their presence to other microbes. So when we spray a biodynamic preparation on the soil, it's sending out an invitation for more microbial life to come and proliferate within the soil. And when we soak our seeds in this compost extract, the seeds get the message in their seed coat that beneficial microbes are waiting for them. So as soon as they germinate, they start producing root exudates to feed the microbes, which support their proliferation, make the roots bigger, make the plants healthier, and more carbon goes underground. It's really cool stuff. Another important benefit to note of all of the practice I've just described is that they help plants adapt to climate change, because we know we're not going back to the stability that earlier generations of farmers used to enjoy. We are going to have more instability no matter what we do, and biodynamic and carbon farming practices can support plants in resisting the pests and diseases that come from climate stress and withstanding things like droughts and floods that we're going to keep having more and more of. Going back to wildfire as an expression of the climate crisis, in my work to generate the land I steward after the wildfire, I've found the biodynamic preparations to be really helpful, because when the wildfire came through, it burned off almost all the organic matter in the soil. And so using the biodynamic preparations helped to bring back that soil life, to activate the conditions for the soil life and the plants to recover. But I want to stress that remediation from wildfire is only one small piece of the puzzle. The fact is that fire is deeply woven into the history and ecology of our landscapes. Since time immemorial, the indigenous people of Washington, California, and many other parts of the world have stewarded the land using fire. The ecosystems we live in have co-evolved with this intentional use of fire, and they need fire to thrive. It's only been in the last 150 years since European settlers arrived in these areas that fire has been suppressed. U.S. policy became focused on Smokey the Bear fire suppression and criminalized the use of fire for land stewardship, preventing indigenous people from continuing this important ecological and cultural practice. Over the past century plus, this lack of intentional fire has meant a huge buildup of dead and dry vegetation that is now fuel for wildfires. And then we have wildfires that are made more extreme by climate change, fueled heat waves, and drought and record-breaking hot, dry winds. The good news is that in recent years, a number of indigenous groups who have been fighting for the right to use the practice of cultural burning are finally getting permission and support to revitalize this essential practice. The Indigenous Peoples Burning Network brings together a number of cultural fire practitioners across Turtle Island, and there are many others who are also practicing at a smaller scale, including closer to here. For those who are not indigenous to this land, prescribed fire is also a tool to promote ecological health and community safety. This is a picture from a prescribed fire that I was on the crew for in May through the Good Fire Alliance, which is my local prescribed burn association. It was also in cooperation with local and state firefighting agencies and was featured in a New York Times short documentary about prescribed fire in California, which you can find the link to on the resources page. And the goals of prescribed fire can include reducing the fuel load near homes in the wildland-urban interface. We were literally in people's backyards doing this burn. It can also help support native grasses and other native plants, or contribute to the viability of cultural burning by local indigenous communities in cooperation with non-indigenous folks. On the land where I live, we got a dramatic example of how intentional fire can protect ecosystems and people. In 2019, we conducted a prescribed burn on 6 acres of forest through the Good Fire Alliance that I just mentioned. And 15 months later, in September 2020, when the wildfire came through, all the land surrounding was severely burned and the prescribed burn area was untouched. On the left, you can see our neighbor's property, which had been left untended for many decades and burned severely in the wildfire. And on the right, you can see our previous prescribed burn area, which was still healthy and green. It did not ignite when the wildfire came through, and it's still an oasis of healthy forests in the midst of the devastation that we're continuing to see. Because there's been such a long buildup of dense woody vegetation through a century of fire suppression, both before a wildfire comes through and even after a wildfire, there's a need to reduce fuels through manual thinning. One common method to deal with material that is thin is called lop and scatter, where the cut material is just left on the ground to decompose. Unfortunately, in the climate I live in, we found that even after a decade, material that was lopped and scattered remains intact, so that treatment doesn't actually reduce the fuel that's available for a wildfire, and that was part of what caused a lot of destruction to our forests in the wildfire last year. So we've switched to doing a lot of pile burning, but unfortunately, going back to the carbon cycle we talked about earlier, when we burn wood, even in a pile burn, that carbon in the wood goes back up into the atmosphere. And the impacts of pile burns are much less than wildfires, so this is still a much better solution, but we want to retain as much carbon as possible, and the way that we've started to do that is make biochar. So to make biochar, if you're doing a pile burn, you will use water to extinguish the pile when it gets to the coals rather than letting it burn all the way to the ash. And what that does is it reduces the carbon dioxide emissions from the pile burn, it keeps a lot of the carbon in the very stable form of biochar, and that also increases the water holding capacity of the soil. So to summarize, the tools that I've discussed so far to address climate crisis and its impacts are compost, biodynamic preparations, multi-species cover cropping, seed baths, culture and prescribed burning, and biochar. And links to learn more about all of these are on my website as linked right there. So let's turn now to facing and addressing injustice in land, labor, and the food system. Here in what's now known as the United States, we have a long legacy of deep harm in agriculture. One of the deeply troubling pieces of our agricultural legacy is land theft and violence to indigenous people. When Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, at least 10 million indigenous people lived in what is now the United States. By 1900, there were less than 300,000. Disease, violence, and forcible removal from their homelands decimated the lives and livelihoods of indigenous people. Since European colonizers arrived here on Turtle Island, settlers and the United States government have systematically and unjustly stolen 98% of the land that indigenous communities have lived on and tended since time immemorial. Wherever you live in the United States, you are on occupied native land. Another deeply disturbing aspect of our agricultural legacy is stolen and exploited labor. A primary reason that European colonists stole land to create the American colonies was to supply the colonizing European countries with agricultural crops like cocoa, coffee, cotton, rice, tobacco, and sugar. In order to grow these crops on a massive scale to bring back to Europe, the colonialists needed labor, and after decimating the populations of people indigenous to this land, they abducted indigenous people from West Africa who had incredible knowledges and practices for growing food and building soil in their subtropical climate. Those human beings were then piled as cargo into the ships that sailed back to the Americas after dropping off those crops in Europe, where they were sold into slavery to grow more crops for the colonizing countries. Over the course of 400 years, the transatlantic slave trade violently ripped 25 to 30 million people from their homelands, where they had lived and grown food in sacred relationship with the land for countless generations. Not only were those people separated from their families, not only did many die in the course of the journey across the Atlantic Ocean, those who survived were then forced into a deeply troubled relationship with the land as agricultural slaves. The legacy of that deeply troubled relationship still lives in our soil and still lives in the souls of human beings. In the United States, agricultural slavery continued for hundreds of years and was only made illegal in 1865. Immediately after slavery was abolished, new laws and practices were put in place to deny African Americans freedom and access to land. Over the course of the past century, racist policies, discriminatory practices by the USDA and the Farm Service Agency, and violent acts of white supremacists have led black farmers to lose 90% of the land that they once owned. Today, less than 1% of the land in the United States is owned by black people, even though they make up 13% of the population, while 98% of land is owned by white Americans. Human atrocities connected to agriculture, almost entirely based on race, have continued to occur to the present day. Chinese farmers were encouraged to immigrate to the United States in the mid-1800s to work on farms and railroads, and they made up 90% of California's agricultural labor force in 1870. Then they were denied their rights to live in the U.S., own property, and travel through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. During World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were landowning farmers, were incarcerated and their land was stolen. And millions of workers, many who have immigrated from Latin America because of the unjust forces of globalization, continue to be exploited, mistreated, and abused through the United States food system, from farm fields to slaughterhouses to restaurants. Injustice and inequity persists in food security and sovereignty as well, as these figures from King County illustrate. Centuries of systemic oppression of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, people of color, women, and LGBTQ communities show up in who has secure access to food and who doesn't. These figures are from 2018 and 19, and food insecurity got much worse when the pandemic hit in 2020, again showing up disproportionately along lines of race and gender. As a person who is racialized as white, as are most of the folks in this room, I have benefited from the many systems that have caused and continue to cause others deep harm. My ancestors were given land through the Homestead Act, land that was stolen from Indigenous people. My ancestors received advantages in education, employment, and housing because they were able to assimilate and become white. My ancestors were able to accumulate financial wealth through these advantages and pass it down to future generations, giving their children and grandchildren opportunities that others did not have. I didn't choose to create these systems. We did not choose to create these systems, but throughout my life, I have participated in them and I have benefited from them. And I feel a deep responsibility to change them for the better, for my own liberation and for the liberation of my fellow human beings. I hope you do too. So what are some specific actions we can take? We can support reparations, rematriation, and land sovereignty for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and other farmers of color. Through this map from the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, farmers of color are claiming their sovereignty and calling for reparations of land and resources so they can grow nourishing food and distribute it in their communities. This map offers a vehicle for people with resources such as land or money to give directly to Black, Indigenous people of color or BIPOC farm projects, including several here in Washington State. Just a few days ago, I attended a great webinar organized by the Sustainable Economies Law Center with practical information about rematriating land to Indigenous communities. And although it was focused on California, much of the content is relevant to any state. I highly recommend watching the recording if you're interested in land back, whether that is land you hold title to or supporting the return of land by someone you know, an organization, a corporation, a land trust, or a local government. This is an example of almost 10,000 acres that was just returned to a tribe last month in Washington State. The land was taken by the US government in 1892 and given to homesteaders. And the transfer of the land back was made through a creative agreement between the tribes, the homesteading family that had owned the land for 5 generations, and a Seattle-based organization called Conservation Northwest. If transferring the title to land isn't feasible or desired by the Indigenous community who would be the recipient, there's also the option of a cultural easement, and this is something that a number of farmers are doing on their farms. So this is similar to a conservation easement, and it gives an Indigenous community the rights to access the land for harvesting, hunting, restoration, ceremony, gatherings, or other purposes that are mutually agreeable to the Indigenous community and the entity that holds title to the land. If you don't currently have capacity to directly give land back, another option is land tax or financial return to the Indigenous people whose land you live on. A local way to do this is real rent Duwamish, which will help you calculate and pay an appropriate rent to the Duwamish people on whose land the city of Seattle sits, and also support them in other ways, like a petition for them to gain federal recognition. For those who live outside Seattle, you can use the Native Land Map to begin learning about the Native people whose land you occupy and how you can support them financially or otherwise. One of the biggest fallacies of the US government is the perpetuation of individual private land ownership. This is something that was not practiced on this continent prior to European contact, and even the concept that land can be owned is something that was and continues to be inconceivable to many Indigenous people. Although government policies such as the Homestead Act, land that was held in common by Indigenous communities was taken away and then granted to individual families who are encouraged to till the soil, deplete the resources, and then sell the land for profit. And in our capitalist economy, private land ownership is one of the drivers of individual and generational wealth, and the fact that white people have had disproportionate access to land ownership for centuries is a big contributor to the enormous racial wealth gap. We now have this privately owned farmland being sold off to foreign investors, pension funds, and the uber rich, and this drives farmland prices way out of reach for the budgets of small and medium-scale sustainable farmers. The concentration of farmland in the hands of non-farmers is also deeply concerning. Bill and Melinda Gates now own more farmland than anyone else in the United States. In addition to and in concert with land return to Indigenous communities and farmers of color, moving land into the commons is an important tool to counter escalating land prices and the concentration of farmland into fewer and fewer hands. One model for this is the agrarian commons, which brings land into local community ownership and stewardship with the support of a national nonprofit land trust, Agrarian Trust, which I recently began working for and which Reese works for as well. The commons is structured as a 501c2 or 501c25 limited scope nonprofit, which holds the title to the land, oversees its ownership, and conveys leases to farmers. The board of each commons is made up of 1/3 farmers, those same farmers who are leasing and stewarding the land, 1/3 local community members, and 1/3 agrarian trust representatives. This open source model is currently being piloted in 13 commons across the United States, including the Puget Sound Agrarian Commons here in Washington, which a number of you got to hear about at the workshop this morning, and which is currently seeking a farmer for its first farm on Whidbey Island. If you missed the workshop, you can find Reese, who introduced me, over there in the back, and learn more about the Puget Sound Agrarian Commons and the process for applying to be the farmer there. I recently joined the Agrarian Trust as a co-facilitator of the New Commons Alliance to connect all of these commons and more that are coming online, as well as other aligned organizations and initiatives to learn from each other and share this model out to other interested communities. Our goal with Agrarian Commons is not only to support farmland access for next generation farmers, but also contribute to land justice. For example, the recently formed Central Virginia Agrarian Commons supports BIPOC control of land for building resilient regional food systems. The founding board members of this commons share a goal of repairing the harms of Black land loss and that have impacted Black farmers in Richmond, Virginia, and the surrounding region. This Agrarian Commons is governed by a majority Black board, centers the interdependence of rural and urban communities, and models land justice through a gift of generationally white-held land. For those of you who are farmers, there are a number of things you can do within your farm business to support food justice. Soulfire Farm created this guide for farmers who want to supply low-income communities while maintaining financial sustainability. And I highly recommend you read the full guide, which is on their website, but I pulled out a couple examples just to share with you some of the wisdom that's within this guide. One of the examples is their sliding scale farm share model. So their shares run from zero cost all the way to $1,000 for the season, depending on the resources that their members have, and includes an option for paying with SNAP and EBT. Another is increasing accessibility through doorstep delivery to low-income communities where transportation is often a barrier to getting fresh food. Soulfire Farm is near Albany, New York, and so they offer doorstep delivery to the lowest income neighborhoods in Albany while asking their customers from wealthier neighborhoods to travel to group drop points within these low-income neighborhoods to pick up their produce. On this slide, I've replaced their map of Albany with a map of the Seattle area. This is from energyjustice.net, and you can see the neighborhoods broken out by income. So if you wanted to follow a similar model, if you were a CSA farmer, you might target the neighborhoods that are red on this map for doorstep delivery. This energy justice map covers the whole United States and maps race as well as income, so it's a great interactive tool to learn more. Besides delivering fresh produce to low-income residents, supporting urban communities and growing their own food is another thing that farmers can contribute to. In response to the pandemic and interruptions to the food supply in the spring of 2020, an organization that I'm part of, Celebrating Women's Leadership in Food, connected urban and rural farmers in a mutual aid project where rural farmers who had extra greenhouse space grew seedlings for urban farmers that didn't have greenhouses so they could grow more food for their own communities. And this is something that was not just a charity model, but really built relationships and connections towards strengthening the local food system and sharing skills and knowledge in all directions, and something that we continued this year and plan to continue next year as well. Another resource from Soulfire Farm is their Food Sovereignty Action Guide, which offers dozens of simple and more complex things that anyone can do, regardless of whether you farm or not, to support justice and food sovereignty, and it's also available on their website. A few of the many action steps in this guide are contacting your elected officials to encourage them to support food justice policies, and Catherine Unn, who's the keynote speaker from the National Young Farmers Coalition tomorrow, will share a lot more in the policy front. Another key action is supporting existing organizations that are led directly by those who are impacted by the issues and putting your skills to work to support Black, Indigenous, people of color-led farms and organizations and buying their products. Since I don't live in this area, I'm not aware of all the local BIPOC-led organizations, but I did some research to find out some that I would encourage you to check out and learn more and do your own research as well. And links to all these organizations are also on the webpage I mentioned before. So this is an article I found from Seattle Met. It lists 9 BIPOC-led farms that deliver produce to Seattle. So this was released on Earth Day of last year, and I'm sure many of them will continue to offer CSAs in the coming year. There's the Black Farmers Collective, Nurturing Roots Farm, Native Work Sovereignty Farm, Kamayan Farm, Ebony by Nature, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, Feast Seattle, and Gathering Roots. And there's a lot more to say about each of those organizations, and you can find links to all of their websites on my website. So just to sum up, these tools that I've recently shared for addressing land and food injustice are land return, rematriation, and reparations, cultural respect easements, agrarian commons, innovative farm business models, cooperation and mutual aid, food, and the food sovereignty action steps like policy advocacy and supporting BIPOC organizations. So I've shared a lot of tools and practices, and while those are important, there's something deeper that is also needed to address these crises. All of the crises that we currently face have a common root. That root is separation. Separation from ourselves, separation from each other, and separation from the earth. That deep wound of separation causes people to lose touch with their humanity and inflict incredible harm on their fellow human beings, to desecrate the living systems that support us. The deep wound of separation has led humans to create structures and systems that exploit, oppress, and extract from some people for the benefit of others, that treat both humans and land as commodities to be used, bought, and sold. All of the tools that I've offered in this talk will be meaningless if we don't also shift our way of being in the world. As one of my beloved teachers, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, says, love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters. To heal the deep wounds in our society and our planet, we must start in our own hearts, cultivating the love that is also justice for ourselves, for our fellow human beings, and for the whole living earth. Only then can we act courageously out of love to create a more healthy and just future for everyone. Thank you. I think we do have time for a couple of questions if you have any, Reese.
Not yet. If anybody has a question, if they want to raise their hands up with their card selected.
All right, so the question is more about how agrarian commons work in practice. How is land use decided? So the structure of the agrarian commons, and feel free to come up and talk more to me and Reese about it because we could be here all day. But just in short, there is in the bylaws of the commons, there is a requirement to practice food production in a sustainable way. And how that's defined depends on the commons, but it's really up to the board of each commons to determine what are the requirements within that. So the idea with the commons is there's equitable governance of the commons that includes the farmers who are stewarding the land as well as local community members and the National Trust. So yeah, I encourage you to learn more. There's a lot on the Agrarian Trust website, agrariantrust.org. And thank you for that question. We're happy to talk more about it. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. I appreciate your listening, and I hope you take some of this and do something with it.
Thank you, Thea. There's just a reminder that Thea will be leading a session, Harvesting Wisdom and Planting Seeds of Renewal, tomorrow, and that session is from 11 to 12:15 p.m. Also, there is a bonus session today via Zoom on Northwest Women Pioneers with multiple Tilth farmers who are panelists, and that link is in the program if you're interested. The next session starts at 1:55. Thank you, everyone.